In the spring of 1944, the Allied command faced a paradox. They possessed overwhelming industrial capacity, superior air power, and a clear numerical advantage in men and materiel, yet the success of the cross-channel invasion would hinge not only on brute force, but on careful management of enemy perceptions. The German High Command, defending the coastlines of Western Europe, had the luxury of interior lines, pre-prepared fortifications, and a reconnaissance apparatus that favored rapid local concentration. For the Allies, landing forces on the French coast required not only landing craft and artillery, but the strategic problem of where the Germans would place their reserves and how quickly they could move them to the threatened sectors. Deception, therefore, became not a sideshow, but an integral instrument of operational design. It was not enough to strike. The strike had to appear where the defender least expected it, and while part of that effort relied on radio traffic, double agents, and dummy installations, one of the most evocative elements was the creation of a phantom army, a deliberately fabricated order of battle that convinced German analysts that the main Allied attack would come somewhere other than Normandy. To understand why the phantom tanks and other decoys mattered, consider the fundamental logistics and timelines facing the German response. The Allies planned to land a substantial force on the Normandy beaches, with initial assault waves that would quickly establish lodgements. Once ashore, the Allies would need time to build up follow-on divisions, armor, and supplies across a narrow beachhead. German doctrine and mobility constraints meant that if they were convinced the main invasion would be at the Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest crossing and therefore a logical point for an invasion, they would keep armored reserves there, ready to throw a decisive counterattack. The Allied objective, therefore, was strategic misdirection, to pin German strategic reserves away from Normandy for long enough to allow Allied forces to consolidate and expand. Deception planners quantified this in simple operational terms. Every day, German armored reserves remained misallocated, translated directly into reduced risk for the beachhead and more time to build the forces needed for a breakout. The engineer of that misdirection was a multi-layered deception plan whose code name, placed under the larger umbrella, is widely known as Operation Fortitude, a component of the broader bodyguard campaign that shielded the Normandy landings. Operation Fortitude itself was not a single trick, but a campaign of illusions. It included two main components: Fortitude North, aimed at keeping German forces in Norway, and Fortitude South, aimed at fixing German attention on the Pas-de-Calais region. The planners worked from a clear set of assumptions about German behavior: that they would lean on logic that favored the shortest crossing, that they would trust signals intelligence combined with visual reconnaissance from the air, and that they would treat reports of heavy concentration in southeast England as a precursor to an assault across the Channel to Pas-de-Calais. To sell that narrative required an entire fabric of corroborating evidence. The British-based London Controlling Section and a specialized deception staff coordinated with theater commanders to produce that fabric. Staff officers, intelligence analysts, and creative technicians were all pressed into service to turn imagination into apparent reality. At the center of Fortitude South's story was the fictional 1st United States Army Group, or FUSAG. Conceived as a notional formation, FUSAG would be commanded by a charismatic and plausible leader, General George S. Patton. Patton's battlefield reputation made him an ideal figurehead for the ruse: aggressive, high-profile, and widely recognized by German intelligence as one of the Allies' most dangerous and competent field commanders. The psychological logic was subtle and powerful. The Germans respected Patton. If they believed Patton was in southeast England with an entire army group, they would reasonably place the main invasion threat opposite Pas-de-Calais. Thus, the planners assigned Patton to an elaborate stage role. He was flown frequently to visible headquarters in southeast England, photographed arriving and departing, seen in conversations with other senior officers, and, perhaps most importantly, kept out of the actual planning and execution roles where his temperament might have caused operational complications. The effect was not merely theatrical. It exploited the enemy's mental models and produced an authoritative shadow army whose presence would steer German dispositions for weeks after June 6th.
But a believable army needs visible hardware.
Armored formations are among the most persuasive indicators of offensive intent because tanks imply mobility, punch, and a capability for exploitation. If German reconnaissance photographed or observed concentrations of tanks, especially of American types familiar to German intelligence, then analysts would update their assessments accordingly. The problem for Allied planners was that diverting real armored divisions to serve the deception would be wasteful and risky. Those tanks were needed where the real invasion would occur. The solution was straightforward and pragmatic: create convincing fake armor. The idea was not novel. Armies had used dummies for centuries, but the scale and integration required for 1944 demanded new methods and organizational structures to make deception operationally effective. Early trials of decoy equipment began as experiments in materials science and visual trickery. Engineers and artists, carpenters and textile workers were tasked with producing shapes that could, from the air or from a distance, pass for tanks, self-propelled guns, and armored personnel carriers. The components were deliberately simple: wooden frames to define silhouettes, canvas stretched to simulate armor plating, and painted finishes to suggest weathering and unit marking. For some purposes, painted wire frameworks on low wheels sufficed. For others, inflatable rubber decoys were developed that could be packed, moved, and erected rapidly. The pragmatic engineering trade-offs were clear. Decoys needed to be lightweight enough for transport and redeployment. They needed to pass the right shadow at the angles and altitudes German reconnaissance aircraft typically flew. And they had to survive the English weather long enough to link their presence to other deception measures, such as fake fuel dumps and simulated tracks. In workshops across southern England, carpenters and canvas workers practiced making convincing tanks out of basic materials. From a distance and at reconnaissance altitude, the human brain and camera lenses would do the rest. Silhouettes and shadows were notoriously persuasive, especially when corroborated by radio chatter and dummy infrastructure. Those early experiments illuminated the limits of visual deception. An immobile line of fake tanks sitting in a field could be detected as suspicious by low-level reconnaissance or by skilled photo interpreters if left without supporting signs of life. Effective deception required coupling the dummy hardware with other indicators: fake tracks, simulated maintenance activity, canvas maintenance shelters, staged fuel drums, and radio traffic that mimic the communication load of a real formation. The deception planners understood that an isolated visual cue was seldom persuasive. Instead, they built layered evidence that could survive different types of German scrutiny: aerial photography, signals interception, and human intelligence. To that end, an organizational structure evolved in the south of England: units dedicated to special means of deception, engineers who could lay out dummy parks, communications specialists who could generate controlled radio traffic, and administrative teams who could produce paperwork, unit signs, and even vehicle registration numbers that looked authentic on close inspection. This multidimensional approach required coordination across Allied services and national boundaries. American, British, and Canadian staffs had to reconcile differences in nomenclature, markings, and operational habits to produce a consistent facade. Allied logistics officers, often focused on keeping real units equipped, now had to allocate scarce materials: a few planks of timber, yards of canvas, a handful of inflated rubber, to a project whose return on investment would not be measured in immediate materiel throughput, but in days of enemy inaction gained. The political dimension was not negligible. Convincing the Germans required not only operational discipline, but also secrecy and compartmentation. Only a handful of officers in each staging area knew the full story. Leaks would ruin the illusion. At the same time, public and press appearances were choreographed to highlight visible troop concentrations in southeastern England without hinting at their true absorptive roles. Another crucial early realization was that deception must be adaptive. German reconnaissance was not monolithic. It included long-range aerial photography, photo interpretation units, human reports from occupied territories, and a sophisticated interception apparatus that attempted to triangulate radio traffic. The Allied response was therefore dynamic.
Dummy tanks might appear one day in an open field and be moved the next, or a fake artillery park might be built in the morning and camouflaged by the afternoon to mimic dispersion. The creative logistics of such movements were impressive. Dummy hardware could be packed into trucks and shifted along secondary roads. Camouflaged nets would obscure the details when aerial reconnaissance came close, and fake tracks, created by dragging planks studded with nails through mud, would suggest the weight and tread of heavy vehicles. These small acts of fabrication, when multiplied across dozens of sites, created a rhythm of activity that matched the expectations of an opposing analyst trying to discern where the main force lay. Yet the planners understood that the most potent deception came from the interplay between visual decoys and controlled human intelligence. The British double-agent system, known as the double-cross or XX system, fed selected information to German handlers. Dozens of German agents had been captured and turned. Their reports, carefully curated and corroborated by other false evidence, reinforced the message that FUSAG faced the Pas-de-Calais. This human layer was arguably as decisive as the wooden tanks. When an agent reported seeing armored concentrations in East Kent, the German High Command was likely to give that claim weight. Deception therefore relied on an administrative theater, fake unit rosters, phony supply manifests, and even staged training exercises that would leave traces for any human or photographic reconnaissance to find. In short, Fortitude sought not mere illusion, but persistent, mutually reinforcing illusion. The organizational and intellectual center of this effort was a small circle of planners who recognized that deception required a narrative. A fake army without a consistent story was easily unpicked. Fortitude's narrative encompassed order of battle, logistic flow, command relationships, and the persona of its field commander. The planners reconstructed every element a German intelligence analyst might expect: credible unit markings, simulated radio nets with realistic traffic volumes, realistic patterns of supply consumption and distribution, and staging areas with the kinds of ancillary activity one would expect of a major headquarters. The narrative logic extended to timing. Fortitude had to be credible long enough to influence German strategic allocations through and beyond the actual invasion date. This implied a commitment not simply to pre-invasion fabrication, but to sustained post-invasion deception, to keep the enemy pinned even after the real assault had begun. The challenges were many. Weather in southern England could quickly ruin delicate canvas decoys. Photographic analysts, especially the Germans who had spent years examining Allied and German formations, could identify inconsistencies. And, most intractable, the Allies had to limit the use of real forces to the extent needed for the invasion, while still creating convincing activity. The answer was tradecraft, a blend of inexpensive visual trickery, careful choreography of movement, orchestrated human reports, and the selective use of real units to provide authentic signals that decoys could latch on to. The result was not a single masterpiece, but a distributed mosaic. In fields, in airfields, along roads, and in radio frequencies, Allied planners layered elements that, when observed separately, might be plausible, but when observed together, produced a compelling illusion of massed armored American poised to strike at Pas-de-Calais.
By the time the invasion was prepared, the Phantom Army had become an organizational reality. It had a headquarters, an identity, and a plausible commander. It had supplies that weren't real, but appeared to be so. It had visual evidence of tanks and artillery built from wood and canvas and rubber. And it had the human corroboration of agents and stage traffic. The genius of the deception planners was not merely in the objects they created, but in their understanding of how an adversary thinks. They built for the enemy's expectations and constraints, not for an idealized model of truth. In that sense, the Phantom tanks were not merely props.
They were instruments of influence, calibrated to change the adversary's decisions. The rest of the story, how these decoys were built, deployed, and integrated with radio traffic and other ruses, belongs to the next part of the narrative. For now, the essential truth is this. In the summer of 1944, Allied planners turned carpentry, canvas, and cunning into strategic leverage, and in doing so, they transformed deception from a sidelines craft into a weapon that shaped the course of one of the most consequential operations of the war. As the Allies moved from planning to implementation, the theoretical framework of deception gave way to the practical challenge of fabrication. If the Phantom Army was to influence German decision-making, it needed tangible, visible evidence. Tanks and artillery were the most convincing signs of offensive capability. The task, however, was monumental. The Allies could not afford to divert real combat units to this ruse, and yet they had to create the impression of dozens of armored divisions arrayed along the southeastern coast of England. The solution lay in ingenuity. Wooden, canvas, and inflatable mock-ups designed to deceive at a distance, coupled with supporting measures that added realism to the illusion. The initial step involved understanding the visual language of reconnaissance. German photo interpreters and aerial reconnaissance pilots were trained to identify armored formations by shape, size, shadow, and pattern. Planners examined the silhouettes of American M4 Sherman tanks, M7 Priest self-propelled guns, and half-tracks, noting the features that could betray a fake if rendered incorrectly. Wooden frames were constructed to mimic these shapes with a high degree of fidelity. Canvas was stretched over the frames to create the appearance of armor plating. To the human eye, from hundreds of feet in the air, the key was proportionality and shadowing. Small deviations in height or length could break the illusion, so measurements were meticulous, with mock-ups being scaled to match the true vehicles as closely as possible. Engineers also accounted for shadow angles, ensuring that the faux tanks appeared convincingly three-dimensional during reconnaissance flights. Inflatable decoys added another layer of sophistication. Developed in workshops across England, these decoys were lightweight, portable, and could be erected quickly. They consisted of rubber or canvas air chambers with painted surface details replicating the distinctive shapes of American armor. Inflatable tanks allowed deception units to create the impression of movement. By repositioning decoys along a road or in open fields, they could simulate an armored formation on the march. Inflatable artillery pieces and trucks were similarly employed, completing the image of a fully equipped army. Although at close range, these decoys were obviously fake. From the air, or across a distance of several hundred meters, they passed German reconnaissance inspection, especially when accompanied by other signs of activity.
Placement strategies were critical. Decoy tanks were not simply scattered randomly. They were arranged to mimic realistic formations and tactical patterns. Reconnaissance experts studied the spacing, orientation, and density typical of U.S. armored divisions. In fields, tanks were positioned in columns or defensive clusters that suggested both readiness for deployment and protection against air observation. Dummy artillery was deployed in battery configurations, with mock supply vehicles and trucks nearby. Roads leading to the decoy formations were marked with tracks and tire impressions to indicate repeated movement of heavy vehicles. Engineers even employed planks with embedded nails or weighted logs dragged across mud to simulate the treads of real tanks, leaving convincing marks for low-altitude observation. In essence, the planners recreated not just the visual signature of armor, but the operational signature, the subtle environmental cues that would make the illusion believable to a trained enemy analyst. Supporting the visual deception, the Allies implemented a sophisticated radio traffic program. Signals intelligence was an essential part of German reconnaissance, and they were known to monitor frequencies for patterns of command and control. The deception planners created realistic radio nets for the Phantom units. Operators transmitted routine messages, including training schedules, supply requests, and reports from fictitious patrols. These transmissions were carefully calibrated in volume and frequency to match what would be expected from a real Army group.
To an analyst, the radio chatter added authenticity, confirming that the visual signs, the tanks, trucks, and artillery, were not empty props, but part of a functioning operational structure. The combination of visual and electronic evidence created a multisensory illusion that was difficult to dispute. In addition to the decoys themselves, planners staged ancillary activities to enhance believability. Field maintenance, simulated camps, and supply depots were constructed using lightweight materials. Fuel barrels, canvas tents, and dummy vehicles were arranged as if supporting a large mechanized formation. Engineers even used smoke generators to simulate activity in motor pools or artillery firing ranges. From the air, these details suggested preparation for offensive operations, reinforcing the narrative of a substantial army poised for action. The careful attention to environmental cues was not trivial. It represented an understanding that enemy intelligence relied on multiple corroborating observations rather than a single indicator. Several case studies illustrate the effectiveness of these measures. In Kent and Sussex, teams of engineers and artists erected decoy Sherman tanks in fields and along minor roads. Aerial photographs taken by German reconnaissance aircraft confirmed the presence of apparent armored divisions complete with adjacent artillery batteries. In some cases, decoys were accompanied by real vehicles positioned to support the illusion. For example, a handful of actual jeeps or half-tracks would be integrated with the mock tanks, providing movement that suggested genuine operational activity. These mixed deployments were carefully choreographed to prevent German analysts from suspecting that the majority of the force was fictitious. The combination of real and fake hardware created a layered deception, enhancing credibility without risking valuable combat assets.
Another crucial aspect was adaptability. The decoys were not static. They were moved to simulate redeployment or rotation. Dummy tanks were occasionally marched from one field to another using trucks or trailers, leaving tire tracks and dust that added realism. Inflatable artillery could be deflated and repositioned, allowing planners to suggest that batteries were being concentrated or dispersed in response to enemy movements. The dynamic nature of the deception meant that German reconnaissance, observing snapshots of activity at different times, would see evidence consistent with a live, operational formation rather than a static display. This temporal dimension was as important as visual accuracy. A formation that never moved or changed was more likely to be flagged as suspicious. Integration with other elements of Fortitude South amplified the effect of the decoys. Fake supply depots, dummy landing craft, and controlled leaks through double agents created a coherent narrative of preparation for a major invasion at Pas de Calais. German analysts, confronted with consistent reports from multiple sources, aerial photography, radio interception, and human intelligence, were led to update their assumptions and reinforce pre-existing beliefs about the location and scale of the threat. In practical terms, this meant that German armored reserves remained concentrated opposite Pas de Calais rather than being redeployed to Normandy, buying the Allies valuable time after the actual landings on June 6, 1944. The psychological dimension of the decoys should not be underestimated. Tanks are not only a measure of combat power, they carry symbolic weight. Their presence implies mobility, firepower, and the potential for decisive action. By creating the impression of hundreds of tanks and accompanying artillery, the Allies projected an image of a force capable of overwhelming any defenders at the targeted landing site. Even if German commanders suspected some deception, the perceived threat was significant enough to justify caution. The planners leveraged this cognitive bias. Observers tend to overestimate visible threats, especially when they align with prior expectations. In essence, the Phantom tanks worked as instruments of influence rather than engaging directly in combat. The technical challenges of crafting these illusions were substantial. Weather in southern England could deteriorate rapidly, threatening the structural integrity of wooden frames, canvas surfaces, and inflatable rubber decoys. Wind, Rain and mud could render the mock-ups implausible or cause them to collapse. Engineers devised solutions such as anchoring frames, reinforcing corners, and applying waterproof coatings. Maintenance crews were assigned to inspect and repair decoys daily, ensuring that the illusion remained credible throughout the critical weeks leading to D-Day. The commitment of manpower and resources to this task underscores the importance the Allies placed on deception as a force multiplier. Material considerations were equally important. Wood, canvas, rubber, and paint were in finite supply, competing with other war production priorities. Deception planners had to innovate with economy, using minimal materials to achieve maximum visual impact. Painted silhouettes, simple geometric shapes, and partial mock-ups were often sufficient when combined with environmental cues. For example, a flat wooden frame, viewed from a distance, with a canvas covering and a few shadows cast by real vehicles, could convincingly resemble a Sherman tank. The principle was pragmatic. The human observer is prone to pattern recognition and may fill in missing details, especially when corroborated by other evidence. Thus, resource efficiency and optical psychology were intertwined in the design of decoy equipment.
Coordination across units and disciplines was critical. Engineers constructing decoys worked alongside artists who refined markings and camouflage patterns. Signal specialists operated radio nets that synchronized with visual cues, while intelligence officers ensured that human agent reports reinforced the narrative. The operation required a high degree of orchestration. Misalignment in timing, placement, or markings could compromise credibility. The success of Fortitude South depended not just on the quality of individual decoys, but on their integration into a comprehensive system of deception, combining physical, electronic, and psychological elements. Case studies from specific locations highlight the complexity of execution. In one example, a field in East Kent was prepared to host a mock armored brigade. Wooden Sherman tanks were positioned in battalion formations, accompanied by inflatable artillery pieces and canvas trucks. Tracks were laid in the surrounding mud to suggest repeated movement. Nearby, tents and temporary shelters were arranged to simulate field maintenance and headquarters activity. Radio operators transmitted routine traffic, and reconnaissance aircraft photographing the area captured the impression of an active, mechanized unit. Similar operations in Sussex and Surrey created a network of visible but fictitious formations, reinforcing the illusion that the Allies were massing for an assault far from the true landing sites in Normandy. The effectiveness of these decoys was magnified by corroborating evidence from other fortitude measures. Controlled leaks through double agents, false supply lists, and dummy camps reinforced the story told by visual and radio cues. German intelligence, seeing multiple lines of evidence converging on a single narrative, was more likely to accept the illusion as reality. In the days and weeks leading up to D-Day, the cumulative effect of these measures shaped German strategic decisions. Units that might have been sent to reinforce Normandy were instead held in anticipation of an attack at the Pas-de-Calais, contributing directly to the success of the real invasion. Ultimately, the creation and deployment of phantom tanks and artillery exemplified a sophisticated blend of craftsmanship, operational insight, and psychological manipulation. The Allies leveraged both the physical characteristics of armored vehicles and the cognitive tendencies of their adversaries to create an illusion of overwhelming force. The decoys themselves were simple in concept: wood, canvas, and rubber. But their integration into a broader system of deception produced effects that far exceeded their material presence. By convincing the Germans of a threat that did not exist, the Allies bought critical time, reduced the likelihood of immediate counterattacks, and demonstrated that in modern warfare, perception can be as decisive as firepower. The lessons of these operations, meticulous planning, multidisciplinary coordination, and attention to psychological detail would resonate in military doctrine long after the guns fell silent in Normandy. By late May 1944, the elaborate preparations for Fortitude South had matured into a functioning, albeit fictitious, army. The visual, electronic, and human intelligence layers had been painstakingly aligned to create a convincing narrative. Hundreds of tanks, artillery, and support vehicles were arrayed in southeast England under the command of General George S. Patton, poised to strike across the narrowest point of the English Channel at Pas-de-Calais. The execution phase of this deception required precision, discipline, and ongoing adaptation to sustain the illusion under constant German scrutiny. The stakes were immense. The success of the Normandy landings depended as much on this psychological misdirection as on the landing craft, paratroopers, and artillery that would soon strike the beaches.
One of the first steps in execution was ensuring that the phantom formations appeared operationally active. Decoy tanks and artillery were repositioned regularly to simulate drills, maneuvers, and redeployments. Inflatable tanks were deflated and moved to new fields. Wooden frames were rotated or rearranged to suggest changes in tactical disposition. Engineers and support personnel went to extraordinary lengths to simulate realism. Smoke generators created the appearance of engine fires or cooking in field kitchens. Canvas tents and temporary structures were arranged to mimic headquarters and maintenance areas, and mock tracks were laid to reflect the movement of heavy vehicles. Observers at reconnaissance altitudes, whether human or photographic, would encounter a pattern of activity consistent with a large, dynamic formation rather than static props. Supporting this visual deception was an ongoing program of signals traffic. Radio operators broadcasted meticulously scripted messages between phantom divisions, headquarters, and supporting units. These transmissions included supply requests, training schedule, reconnaissance reports, and administrative communications, all designed to match the expected traffic volume and pattern of a genuine army group. Analysts of the German Abwehr and Luftwaffe Signals Intelligence Network monitored the traffic, logging frequency, call signs, and volume. By replicating the communications footprint of an actual army, the Allies enhanced the credibility of the visual decoys. Radio deception and physical illusions reinforced each other. The eye might see tanks, the ear might intercept plausible chatter, and together they confirmed the existence of a formation that was largely fictional. Human intelligence played a complementary role. Allied double agents, part of the XX network, fed carefully curated reports to German handlers. These reports included details of troop movements, mock exercises, and construction of supply depots. The agents' credibility was critical. German intelligence had previously relied on their information and trusted their observations. By coordinating these human sources with the decoy hardware and radio traffic, the Allies created a multimodal illusion. Each layer corroborated the others, making the deception resilient to individual inconsistencies. For instance, even if an aerial photograph revealed minor flaws in the decoys, a supporting agent report or radio transmission could reinforce the perception of authenticity. The geographical layout of decoy deployments was deliberately chosen to maximize plausibility. Southeastern England, including Kent, Sussex, and parts of Surrey, offered terrain compatible with armored formations, open fields for mock battalions, secondary roads for simulated movements, and proximity to ports and airfields that could sustain logistics. Planners paid attention to distances and orientation. Tank mock-ups were positioned to cast realistic shadows at the angles observed by Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes. Artillery placements mirrored authentic battery spacing and field orientations. Even minor details such as the alignment of fuel barrels and the orientation of canvas tents were calibrated to reinforce the illusion. The Germans, observing these cues, interpreted them as credible evidence of the presence of multiple armored divisions. The psychological impact on German intelligence cannot be overstated. By May and early June 1944, German analysts had developed a mental model of the Allied order of battle that included the fictitious Fusag as the principal striking force. The presence of visible tanks, artillery, and auxiliary units in southeastern England confirmed their expectations, while the absence of similar concentrations near Normandy reinforced the false assumption that Normandy was a secondary threat. The Allies had effectively manipulated enemy cognitive biases. When faced with visual, electronic, and human evidence that aligned with pre-existing assumptions, the Germans overestimated the threat opposite Pas-de-Calais and underestimated the forces in Normandy. This misperception delayed the redeployment of armored reserves, a critical factor in the initial success of the landings.
The execution phase also involved contingency planning. Allied deception officers recognized that weather, reconnaissance timing, and chance encounters could expose the ruse. Flexible strategies were developed to adjust decoy positions, radio traffic, and agent reports in response to German observations. For example, when Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights altered their patrol patterns, decoy tanks were moved or supplemented with additional visual cues to maintain credibility. The planners treated deception as a dynamic process, requiring continuous monitoring and rapid response, rather than a static arrangement of props. This adaptability was a hallmark of Fortitude's operational sophistication, demonstrating an advanced understanding of both enemy behavior and the practicalities of large-scale camouflage. On June 6, 1944, the Normandy landings commenced. While paratroopers descended behind enemy lines and amphibious assault waves struck the beaches, the Phantom Army continued to fulfill its role. The decoy formations, radio traffic, and agent reports maintained the impression of imminent activity opposite Pas-de-Calais. German commanders, expecting the main assault at the narrower crossing, held substantial armored reserves in the wrong location. This misallocation contributed to the relative success of the landings, as German counterattacks could not be rapidly concentrated on the Normandy beachhead. In essence, the Phantom tanks and accompanying deception measures bought the Allies critical time. The initial consolidation of beachheads, the establishment of supply lines, and the buildup of reinforcements proceeded with reduced risk from armored counterattacks. The aftermath of the operation offers insight into the effectiveness of these measures. Post-war analyses, including examination of German intelligence reports, indicate that Fortitude South achieved its primary objective, convincing the German High Command of a credible, immediate threat at Pas-de-Calais. Intercepted communications and post-invasion interrogations revealed that German commanders expected an attack there even after the Normandy landings had begun. This delayed the redeployment of several panzer divisions and other mechanized units, allowing the Allies to secure footholds and eventually advance inland. The Phantom tanks, although materially insignificant, played a decisive role in shaping enemy decision-making, illustrating the principle that perception can be as influential as firepower in warfare. Several quantitative indicators reinforce the impact of the Phantom formations. German reconnaissance reports consistently overestimated the size of forces in southeastern England by tens of thousands of personnel. Estimates of tank strength were similarly inflated, with some reports suggesting the presence of dozens of armored brigades where only a few real units existed. Post-war analysis of Luftwaffe reconnaissance photography confirms that many images interpreted as active armored concentrations were in fact decoys. The ability of such simple materials, wood, canvas, rubber, to generate such profound misperceptions underscores the ingenuity of Allied deception techniques.
In addition to strategic effects, the operation demonstrated the power of multi-layered deception. Physical decoys alone would not have been sufficient. Only when combined with radio traffic,
human intelligence, and environmental staging did the illusion become compelling. This integration illustrates a broader principle. Effective deception operates across multiple channels, exploiting the limitations and expectations of the adversary's sensory and cognitive systems. The Allies in 1944 demonstrated an advanced understanding of these principles, achieving a level of sophistication that would influence military doctrine for decades. Modern militaries continue to study Fortitude South as a case study in the design and implementation of operational deception. The execution of the Phantom Army also yielded lessons in coordination, resource allocation, and psychological operations. Units responsible for decoy construction and deployment had to synchronize with signals teams, intelligence officers, and real combat units to maintain consistency. Resource constraints demanded creativity, as relatively inexpensive materials were leveraged to produce outsized strategic effects. The operation validated the concept that deception could function as a force multiplier, enabling a smaller or more dispersed actual force to achieve objectives by manipulating enemy perception. The meticulous attention to detail, from shadow angles to radio net volume, reinforced the importance of discipline and planning in large-scale deception operations. Finally, the historical significance of the Phantom tanks and broader Fortitude operation lies not only in their immediate tactical and strategic effects, but also in their demonstration of human ingenuity under conditions of extreme pressure. Engineers, artists, intelligence officers, and soldiers collaborated to transform simple materials into instruments of influence, shaping enemy decisions without firing a single shot. The careful study of enemy expectations, the orchestration of visual and electronic cues, and the disciplined execution of a complex dynamic plan exemplify the intersection of art, science, and strategy in military operations. In the broader context of World War II, the Phantom Army stands as a testament to the critical role of perception management and operational deception in modern warfare. In conclusion, the execution of Fortitude South and the deployment of Phantom tanks and artillery represent one of the most successful examples of strategic deception in military history. By integrating visual, electronic, and human intelligence measures, the Allies created a credible threat that misled German commanders and altered the allocation of enemy forces. The operation highlights the interplay between psychology, technology, and operational art, demonstrating that the effective manipulation of perception can yield consequences as tangible as any battlefield engagement. The Phantom Army, constructed from wood, canvas, and ingenuity, helped ensure the success of the Normandy landings and reshaped understanding of how deception can serve as a decisive instrument of war. Its legacy continues to inform military planners and historians, illustrating the enduring principle that in warfare, what the enemy believes can be as consequential as what actually exists.